All right, hello everyone. This is Kellen Reed with the Daisy and ECTA Centers. Be the host of today's webinar. My goal is just to make sure everything goes smoothly today. And while people are still joining, just wanted to cover some logistics. And then the first one, then they're also shown here on the first slide. You are muted now when you came in, and we want to make sure we have a good recording for the webinar. So we'll be recording, and then that will be shared as well as other information and the PowerPoint or links and resources that the presenters are sharing. And when it comes time for questions, which I know our presenters will be encouraging, you can open up your chat window. There's a little toolbar that pops up when you hover over it at the bottom, allowing you to open up the chat window. So you can enter your questions there directly. We'd also like to hear from you. So if you would raise your hand, another option on your toolbar at the bottom, then I will come along and unmute you so you can speak to everyone. And then lastly, we'll have an evaluation that will be sent out at the conclusion of this webinar. And we really do appreciate your feedback on that. So I think that covers our logistics for today. I'm going to hand it over to Debbie.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on evaluating implementation of evidence-based practices, tips for improving quality and feasibility. I'm Debbie Shaver from the Daisy Center, and I'm joined today by Margaret Gillis of the Daisy Center, Katie McCullough from the Early Childhood TA Center, and Stacy Kong from Hawaii Part C. Today's webinar is an encore webinar. We presented this content at the August Improving Data, Improving Outcomes conference. And you may have also, if you participated in the online workshop series about a year ago, we covered this content there as well. So if you have heard us before, we welcome you back. And for those for whom this is the first time, we welcome you as well. What we are hoping to accomplish today is to increase participants' understanding of some basic evaluation principles related to evaluating practice implementation. We will cover some features of high-quality tools and methods for evaluating practice implementation. We hope also that we will increase your understanding or help you increase understanding of some strategies for making this process more practical for you. And then finally, very briefly, we will talk about summarizing data on practice implementation for different purposes. So we will do all that in 4 sections. First, we will be talking about what are we measuring and why. Then we will look at how are we measuring. And then what do we do with all this data? And then finally, we will hear from Hawaii. And so I am going to turn it over to Katie McCullough, who is going to talk about what are we measuring and why.
Thanks so much, Debbie. All right, so I'm going to launch us into the discussion about what we are measuring and why. What we are measuring is practices. Probably many of you are familiar with this visual depiction of the ECTA DAISY system framework. And our focus here is on this middle box about the implementation of evidence-based practices. But we know that we have to have a high-quality state infrastructure to support the implementation of evidence-based practices in order to achieve the desired result of positive outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. So what's the definition of practices? Practices are the teachable and doable behaviors that practitioners use with children and families, which can be used, replicated, and measured for fidelity. The practice needs to be clearly defined in order to be measured. So we need to be sure that everyone who's involved in the implementation and measurement of these practices knows what the practices are, what they look like, and how we are going about measuring them in the implementation process. So examples of evidence-based practices I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but some are the pyramid model, the DEC recommended practices, coaching and natural learning environments, routines-based interview, family-guided routines-based intervention, just to mention a number of many of the practices that are currently being implemented through states Part C SSIPs currently. So more on definitions. Practice change is the increase or decrease in the number, frequency, precision, or quality of practice a practitioner implements across at least 2 points in time. Fidelity, on the other hand, is the degree to which an intervention or practice is delivered as the developers intended. Fidelity implies strict and continuing faithfulness to the original innovation or practice that is expected to lead to the desired child and family outcomes. This is critical in terms of the fidelity piece because you wouldn't expect for there to be positive or desired child and family outcomes if those practices are not being implemented at Fidelity. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So what's the relationship between practice change and practice fidelity? Both practice change and practice fidelity are about implementation of evidence-based practices. But with practice change, we're getting at our practitioners changing their implementation of evidence-based practices. Ideally, that's going to be increasing, but not necessarily, so you want to be tracking that, right, over time. We're also wondering if practitioners are implementing evidence-based practices as intended, which again is the fidelity measure around practice implementation. Practitioners can demonstrate changes in practices without reaching fidelity, and that's okay. These incremental changes are data that you want to be collecting to sort of see maybe at an intermediate stage of your implementation how things are going and whether or not you need to make some course corrections along the way. Practice change and fidelity, ideally, they are the same tools or methods to evaluate both fidelity and practice change. Practice change can be evaluated in relation to the fidelity threshold. So are your practitioners moving closer to that threshold of practice fidelity or not? If not, why not? And what implications are there for issues or challenges that may need to be addressed? So why measure practice change and practice fidelity? Again, as I've already touched on, to ensure that practices are implemented as such that improved outcomes are expected, to determine whether practitioners maintain fidelity over time, and to obtain information for monitoring progress. Those incremental increases towards fidelity can indicate that improvement strategies are working and highlight areas or not, right? And if they're not, highlight areas where practitioners may need additional support. And those corrections or mid-course adjustments in practice can be made in a timely manner. So now we're going to start moving into evaluation, and we want to make sure that we're all being consistent in sort of these key evaluation components that you would have in your evaluation plan. And there's 4 primary: outcomes, evaluation questions, performance indicators, and measurement or data collection methods. The outcomes essentially are a statement of benefit or change that you expect. And they pretty much come in 2 dimensions: when you would expect those outcomes to occur, whether that be short-term, intermediate, or long-term, and the level at which you are defining your outcome, whether it's the state level, program level, practitioner, or child and family level. The evaluation questions are key questions the state wants to learn and answer with the evaluation. And these can come into 2 main areas: the process of the implementation in order to figure out how it's going, are we being effective in implementing our planned activities, and the outcomes about what did it do, are we achieving the results that we intended. What a performance indicator will do for you is provides an item of information or evidence that a certain condition exists or that certain results have or have not been achieved. And there are a number of types of these indicators, and they include those that measure inputs, process, outputs, and outcomes. Good performance indicators identify specific, observable, and measurable pieces of information that require the use of such terms as like the number of, or the percent of, mean of, or similar phrases to that. And measurement data collection methods, I think you guys are familiar with these, but they identify the evaluation methods that will be used to collect the data for each indicator and who the data will be collected on. So now that we have those established 4 areas, I'm not going to read them again, but what's vital with your evaluation plan is that you have alignment across each of these essentially components of your evaluation plan. This is the most critical thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to show you guys an example. And this provides a sample outcome description with an associated evaluation question and a performance indicator. And what I'd like you to do is look at them briefly on your own and see if you believe they are aligned. So what you do is you start with the outcome. Providers use evidence-based practices to support social emotional skills with parents and infants and toddlers identified with social emotional needs. The evaluation question in this example is, do providers know how to use evidence-based practices to support social and emotional skills with parents and infants and toddlers identified with social emotional needs? And the performance indicator in this example is 80% of providers completed training on evidence-based practices to support social emotional skills with parents and infants and toddlers with social emotional needs. So here we have providers use, right? What's the verb here? Providers use evidence-based practices. But in this example, the evaluation question is, do providers know how to use? Well, that wasn't our original outcome, but that's what this is listed here in this example. The performance indicator here is that a percentage of providers have completed training, but that doesn't indicate whether or not they use evidence-based practices. Do you see the gap here in the alignment? Let me show you what this would look like if it were aligned. Providers use evidence-based practices to support social emotional skills is the outcome. So the evaluation question should then be, do providers use evidence-based practices to support social emotional skills? And the performance indicator is 80% of providers use evidence-based practices to support social emotional skills. When you see it laid out this way, it seems so simple, and yet in many of the evaluation plans that we've seen, we don't see this alignment. And so being clear and explicit about what your desired outcome is, what your evaluation question is, and what your performance indicator is critical, and that these 3 categories are aligned with one another. All right. Not rocket science, but an important thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to pass this on over to Margaret, who's going to talk with us about how are we measuring practices. Margaret?
Great, thank you, Katie. So now we're going to talk about how in the world we measure evidence-based practices. Next slide, Katie. So first we need to define and operationalize evidence-based practices. Katie mentioned that the practice needs to be clearly defined. This is a key piece of information that helps make sure that anyone who is implementing the practice, observing the practice, or rating the practice have the same understanding of what the practice is when they see it and are consistent in how they're identifying it. So practices that are not clearly defined and operationalized are not measurable. So we want to make sure that we're very clearly defining and operationalizing our practices. Some practices are clearly defined. They may have been defined by a model developer. So for instance, Pyramid Model has clearly defined practices that are very clearly outlined in both their materials and in their tools. If you are using a practice or an intervention that does not have a tool with it or is not as clearly defined, you can use something called a practice profile as a way to define and articulate what acceptable and non-acceptable practices look like. So when you get the slides, and yes, these will be posted, there is a link there to the NERN National Implementation Network resources on developing practice profiles. So a practice profile itself is not a measurement tool, but it can be used as a starting place to develop or identify a tool for assessing practice change and fidelity. So once you have a practice profile, you can assign metrics to that and create a tool if needed, if one does not exist. So it's also important to balance high quality and practical measurement. We know that for those of us on the ground, it's really hard. You know, you're not going to be doing a standardized RCT kind of study typically to evaluate implementation of evidence-based practices. But it's important that you have as high quality an evaluation as possible, but that it's still practical. So the higher the quality of measurement, of your measurement approach, the more useful and actionable your data are. The key is to make sure that you're getting the most meaningful, accurate, and reliable information possible. We recommend, again, using the tools that go with an intervention. If you're using an intervention such as Pyramid or Sheldon and Rush's models or Robin McWilliams models, and contact the model developer if you are thinking you might need to adapt the tool that you're using. Measurement needs to be doable and practical, and sometimes we have to sacrifice quality a little bit, but sometimes we also need to push on practical so that the data is really meaningful. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Some characteristics of high quality measurement. Your tool should be aligned with the selected evidence-based practices. So Katie highlighted that alignment in your evaluation plan. We also want alignment between your tool and your evidence-based practice. The tool should also provide valid information that's accurate information on practice implementation. It should also be reliable, that it produces consistent information across users, across settings, activities, and time points. And it should also be practical, that it can be used with the staff and resources available. Again, thinking about that definition of practices, the tool should focus on behaviors because we're looking at the behaviors that are being done rather than knowledge or competence. We also want to make sure that the tool could be used to measure practice change and fidelity so that you can get information about incremental change. It's important to note that there is a hierarchy to this list as well. So practicality is important, but if the tool is not aligned with your evidence-based practices, or if it does not provide valid or reliable information, then it's not going to be meaningful data, and it's not going to really be helpful to you. Some characteristics of high quality measurement. The tool should provide a meaningful threshold score that indicates whether practitioners have reached that level of implementation that is sufficient for achieving targeted child or family outcomes. Sometimes the developer of a Fidelity tool has set the threshold, and sometimes they have not. The threshold should be meaningful and reasonable. So for example, you wouldn't expect perfection 100% of the time. But if there is not a threshold score for the tool that you're using, again, you can work with model developers or the tool developers to identify that. And there's also ways that you can work with experts and practitioners to identify what a meaningful fidelity threshold score might be. We're not going to get into that in this presentation, but we do have a forthcoming resource that Debbie will mention a little bit later. So again, if you're using a tool developed for a model, you should use that tool and work with the developers. We know that thresholds can be difficult and many tools don't have them assigned, but there are some ways you can identify that piece of information. The tool should also capture variation over time and across practitioners so that you can see that incremental change towards fidelity. So it shouldn't just capture, yes, they meet fidelity or no, they don't, but be able to capture that variation so you can see levels of quality and then also that progression towards fidelity and that increase in quality. It should also provide useful information to practitioners to identify areas of strength and areas for improvement to move toward reach and maintain fidelity. So some other considerations to improve quality of evaluation of practices: the timing and frequency of the measurement. The tool should be used at sufficient frequency to measure that incremental improvement, practice change, and maintenance of fidelity over time. So once practitioners reach fidelity, we don't stop evaluating. We check back in to see that they're maintaining fidelity. And you want to be evaluating and collecting data at frequent enough time periods that you have time again to do that in time. Those changes, you can make those changes and provide additional support if needed as you go. And so you're not checking in just a year later to see where they are at this point if they didn't meet fidelity at the first time point. There should also be training, clear instructions and training provided for the tool, whether it's a tool that someone is using to observe a practitioner, or whether it's clear training for and instructions for someone who's completing a self-assessment so that they know how to rate themselves. For example, if you're using a tool that talks about frequency of practices, then it should be really clear, what that frequency is. So everyone would be interpreting, the rating scale points in the same way instead of different definitions of those rating scale points. The purpose of the data collection should also be clear. That practitioners and data collectors understand how to collect data and how it's going to be used for implementation. This can increase practitioners and data collectors' buy-in and their commitment to collecting high-quality data. It's also important to note, in some states for SSIP and in other places, you may have people who are using the same evidence-based practice, or they may be using different evidence-based practices across the state if there's local choice or something like that. If you have people using multiple evidence-based practices, in each of the places that are using one particular evidence-based practice, you should use the same tools so that you can compare across programs for practitioners who are using the same evidence-based practice. It also helps to streamline your training and all of that. So data collection methods. A few common data collection methods are observation by someone else, practitioner self-report, and review of documents. So each of these methods has pluses and minuses. Observation by someone else is going to give you the best information about practice implementation because it's observation of actual practice rather than someone's reflection on what they do themselves or what they report in written documents. So if at all possible, we definitely encourage you to try to do some observation of practices. And we'll talk about some strategies for how you might build that in just a minute. Practitioner self-report is another very common way of collecting data on practice implementation, where practitioners are reporting how often they're using particular practices, the quality of the practices, and things like that. However, practitioner self-report can be biased. Sometimes there's that social bias that happens because we want to rate ourselves more highly, and so we might be more lenient or more generous with ourselves, or in some cases, we may be harsher on ourselves and not give ourselves credit for what we're actually doing, that somebody might actually be able to observe. And document review, again, that might not necessarily capture all of the pieces of information that you really want about how a practice is actually implemented and the quality of how that practice is implemented. Multiple methods can be used, and that can be a good way to triangulate your data. So if you have practitioner self-report, you can do observation with some and see if there are, if they're matching up, if those are really consistent across practitioners, and that gives you some good information. You can also use qualitative methods. So qualitative methods, again, there's a link here to some resources, including a DAISY webinar from January 30th. And qualitative methods are a little bit easier to collect than some other methods, but they can be more challenging to analyze because, as you can imagine, trying to analyze interviews or focus groups and things like that take quite a bit of time. So using mixed methods, so a combination of observation, self-report, ratings, and things like that, with interviews and focus groups to help you understand the underlying factors that go into how practitioners are implementing practices, can give you really great information about what's going on in terms of implementation of practices. So you might be overwhelmed by now, so please take a breath. So we can make it practical. So there are ways to make this practical. One way is to leverage existing processes and structures. So if you have supervisors or coaches, those people can observe practitioners implementing evidence-based practices. And that is a great option because it can help improve implementation as well, because those people can then support practitioners to improve their practices. Also, start with existing tools. Don't feel like you need to create a tool all on your own. Start with Fidelity tools that are associated with a model. There are also great tools on DEC recommended practices. And then there are other tools that exist out there that some people have made and have been using that you might be able to have access to, or other tools that you can find that are already there that you might be able to use to look at your practices. Prioritize the practices to be evaluated. It may not be practical to evaluate every single practice that's associated with the evidence-based practice you're looking at. So think about the ones that will have the most impact and that are most important for practitioners to be implementing, and focus on those practices. And then start small. So again, think about having a subgroup of practitioners or programs that you use more intensive evaluation measures with. So for example, observations. Instead of, scaling up your evaluation so you're observing every single practitioner in the state from day one, maybe you have a couple different programs who are piloting that observation tool and procedure for you. And so you can get that observation information and then use something like a self-assessment with the rest of the practitioners in the state. So it's important not to sacrifice quality too much for practicality, but there are ways that you can build on what exists and start small and then scale up to get high quality data and information about how practitioners are implementing practices. So that is it for me. I am going to now pass it off to Debbie to talk about what do we do with all this data.
Thank you, Margaret. Before we proceed, we thought this might be a good time to encourage you to ask questions. We are covering a lot of content relatively quickly. We are going to point you to some resources at the end, but if you want to ask a question, there are two ways to do that. If you hover your mouse, I believe you should have it at the bottom. There's the chat box. If you select the chat, it'll open up the chat box. Or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. So I'm just going to wait a minute and see if we have any questions at this point. So go ahead and ask any questions that come to you in the chat, and I will continue with the slides. And as we see the questions, we will do our best to answer them. Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about what to do with all your data, because part of a high quality evaluation is producing information that's going to be useful and actionable to decision makers. So this slide, purposes of data analysis and use. You want to be clear about this before you begin analyzing your data, and actually before you even launch the whole evaluation. And so you will want to ask yourself some questions. What do you want to know from your data? And what information do decision makers at each level of the system, local, regional, state, or whatever levels are in your state. So what do these different decision makers need to have, or what are the decisions that they make, and what kind of data do they need to improve practice implementation? And the type of decisions made at each of these different system levels, that drives the evaluation questions and what would be an appropriate analysis. So we're going to look at a few example evaluation questions. And so these are evaluation questions at different system levels. At the practitioner level, an evaluation question could be, is this practitioner implementing the practice with fidelity? That might be a question that a coach or supervisor would be asking. If you are someone at the program level, an administrator or someone who works with multiple practitioners, you would be interested in knowing, are practitioners implementing the evidence-based practice with fidelity? So looking across the program. And then which components of the fidelity tool show the greatest growth across practitioners, the least growth? This question is good when you have different components of the practice that you are measuring with your tools. And so you can tell, which specific content areas do we need to perhaps provide further support to our practitioners. And then if you are at the state level, here are a couple evaluation question examples. Are practitioners within local programs across the state implementing the practice with fidelity? And what percentage of programs meet a performance indicator for the percentage of practitioners at fidelity? That's a mouthful, and I'm going to unpack that a little bit more on the next slide. So one strategy for producing actionable data is to aggregate your data. So this is an example of using individual scores from practitioners, whatever the tool was to assess practice implementation for individual practitioners, and rolling the data up to different organizational units. So here on the left, we have a practitioner, and in this case, this practitioner did not reach fidelity based on the fidelity threshold score. The next column at the program level, in this program, they rolled up all of the practitioners in that program and learned that 72% of their practitioners reached fidelity. If you are an administrator of this program, you would use this finding to decide you've got over a quarter of your practitioners who are not reaching fidelity, so you need to decide how to address that and look into that further. If you are a district or a region that has multiple programs, or maybe a large organization that has multiple sites, you would then be rolling up your data on individual practitioners to that district or regional level. And in this district, they learned that 68% of practitioners across the district reached fidelity. With that information and with additional information from their tool, as a district or a region, they can decide, well, where are we having trouble? This percentage isn't as high as we wanted, so what can we do as a district or a region to better support our practitioners? And then going across once more to the right, and I'm still on that top layer of boxes. At the state level, in the state, 62% of practitioners across the state reached fidelity. This might be something that you would report to your stakeholders and maybe on like an SSIP report. But at the state level, this is not very actionable because states do not generally work directly with practitioners. States are generally supporting regions and local programs. So if you look down to the bottom two squares, I'm just going to look at the one under the state. So on that bottom right corner. So this is where we're talking about a performance indicator for programs. And I'm going to read the finding. 55% of programs in the state had at least 80% of practitioners reaching fidelity. This is a state that decided to set a performance indicator for programs at 80% of practitioners reaching fidelity. So to this state, a program would demonstrate success by showing that this high percentage of practitioners were reaching fidelity. And then they can look at the top part of the statistic. 55% of our programs have reached that performance indicator. And so a state's going to be making decisions about infrastructure, what do we need to do with our training and coaching system, and looking at variation by program to see, well, which programs are having more trouble. So these are just different examples of taking those findings about individual practitioners, rolling those findings up to these different units so that the people making decisions at those levels have good information about the topics that they have some control over. Let's see, I see a question. So a question about the threshold score. Is there a place to learn more about this? Yes, there is. I'm going to cover that at the end. We're going to point you to some resources, and DAISY and ECTA, we are just putting out a resource on that topic. So we will get to that in a few minutes. But first, I want to turn it over to Stacy Kong from Hawaii, and she's going to share about how her state has approached this challenging task of evaluating practice change and practice fidelity.
Great, thank you. So for Hawaii SIMR, we went with summary statement 1 in that we are going to look at our 4 demonstration sites and look at infants and toddlers with disabilities and how many have substantially increased their rate of growth in social-emotional skills by the time they exit early intervention. So these are our 3 broad improvement strategies. And we have implementation work groups that addresses each of these broad improvement strategies. So we have a professional development and technical assistance implementation work group, and they focus on enhancing the statewide system of professional development to ensure implementation of evidence-based practices around primary service provider approach to teaming and coaching model in the natural learning environment to support social-emotional development with fidelity. We also have a focus on our fiscal, and we actually have 2 implementation work groups that address our fiscal goal of increasing the capacity of EI programs to provide services and supports to address social-emotional development. So our 1 implementation work group focuses on staffing, and our other implementation work group focuses on telepractice services and supports. And then our 3rd area is on monitoring and accountability. And that implementation work group focuses on enhancing the child outcome summary process to ensure data are accurate and reliable and ensure program effectiveness to support evidence-based practices to improve children's social-emotional development. So when we looked at our evidence-based practices and our measurement tools in our different work groups, our upfront primary focus was really around the professional development because there was a lot of training and support we needed to provide to our demonstration sites. One of the first things we had to do was identify if our programs had the infrastructure that was needed to implement the primary service provider approach to teaming. And we used the checklist for implementing a primary coach approach to teaming developed by Sheldon and Rush. And this measures our infrastructure. So we were fortunate in Hawaii because we already had the infrastructure in place in terms of our programs had the required positions allotted to each program to implement the primary service provider approach to teaming, meaning that each of our programs had a physical therapist, a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist, and a special education teacher. One of the challenges, even though that they have the infrastructure in place, Hawaii is plagued with staff vacancies, and this continues to be a huge challenge for Hawaii, which is why our fiscal was identified in terms of addressing our staffing and having qualified staff to implement evidence-based practices. So in looking at the coaching model, we developed a socio-emotional self-assessment that measures practice change. And we use Sheldon and Rush's coaching log summary form that measures fidelity. And then Sheldon and Rush also developed a form that looked at social emotion companies' coaching log review, which we were piloting. And so in light of the fact that Hawaii continues to have staff vacancies and it impacts our system, we knew that we needed to focus and develop our process for self-sustainability because of our ongoing staff vacancies and because we couldn't afford to always bring Sheldon and Rush back to Hawaii every time we had new staff that we needed to train. So we worked with Sheldon and Rush very closely, and they worked with our mentors on inter-rater reliability and provided extra training for our mentors so that we could continue providing that kind of level of support to new staff and our existing staff who was still in the process of working towards fidelity. We created our own training on the model as well as a mentors training so that we could train and increase our pool of mentors to provide the ongoing support to our providers. So the training has gone through many revisions based on feedback from our demonstration sites after we piloted the training. And we just did a training for our new mentors, and we are in the process of piloting our guidelines around that and the process of that mentoring, and to see how we can really ensure that our mentors are feeling confident in their role and what kind of supports do we need to put in place to ensure success. So we have just started that whole process, and the anecdotal feedback that we received so far from the mentors that are in the process of working towards fidelity, as well as our mentors who have reached fidelity, is that while very time intensive, the process has been beneficial for both mentors, because even the mentors at Fidelity are finding that having that opportunity to process with the mentors who are in training, as well as their other mentors who are at Fidelity, it just reinforces what they've learned. So that's where we're at. And that process, which has been painful and very time intensive for us. The coaching, the social emotional competencies coaching log review, we are really at a place now that we're trying to decide if this is something that we're going to continue using. The mentors didn't feel confident in using the tool, and so we're looking at, is it really capturing what we wanted to capture, and do we really need to do it, or is there another way that we can capture that information? So that has kind of been on hold for us right now. And then for our cost process, we just adapted the Child Outcome Summary Team Collaboration Quality Practices checklist that is on the ECTA website. And we're looking at using it as a monitoring tool. And the work group is in the process of trying to develop a fidelity criteria and a process to ensure inter-rater reliability when using that tool. When we participated in the evaluation series, the webinar series, and we were looking at our evaluation plan, we realized that our evaluation plan was not in alignment. And through that process, We ended up adding a short-term outcome that was previously missed, but we felt was vital to the work that was being done. We also deleted a short-term outcome that we found was already embedded in another outcome. And we deleted an intermediate outcome because the feedback that we got from our demonstration sites was that it was very time intensive to track, and we found that it was really not necessary. And then for all of our evaluation outcomes, while we talked about measurement, we talked about data collection method and measurement intervals, the missing piece that we didn't have was about data management. And the data management was the area that addressed, who entered the data, how will data be stored, how will data be entered, when will it be entered, and how will it be transmitted. So we added that data management piece to all of our evaluation outcomes. And then we also included analysis descriptions to our outcomes. So this is an example of our evaluation plan, and we really worked with our TA providers to help us to make sure that it was in alignment, and so we revised a lot of our components of our evaluation plan. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to pause again for any questions and comments. Again, to access the chat box, make sure to hover at the bottom of your screen and select the chat. If you would like to get your phone unmuted to ask a question, you need to raise your hand. I wish it was a little simpler, but the technology is such that first you have to raise your hand and then we can unmute you. So why don't we go ahead and I'll go to summarizing our comments, and as people have questions, we will address them. So just our big takeaway points. We talked a lot about alignment, and Stacy talked about how her state looked at that again and made some adjustments to make sure everything was aligned. Practices are behaviors. As Margaret said, knowledge and competence is important, but when you're talking about evaluating practice change and fidelity, you need to be measuring behaviors in some way. Margaret also talked about high quality measurement. The higher the quality, the more meaningful and useful your data will be. And she also mentioned that with independent observations, this is often more objective than practitioners self-report, and an observation is measuring actual practice as opposed to someone's report of their own practice. And we all know that it needs to be practical and that there's a balance in high quality and practical. It's challenging to figure out where that balance is, but you don't want to sacrifice too much quality because otherwise you're not getting good data. And then I talked about the importance of summarizing data for different systems levels so that your data are usable and actionable. Next slide. And so again, if you have a question, write it in the chat. So some resources. I mentioned that DAISY and ECTA have developed some tip sheets on evaluating practice implementation. We expect those to be available, I'm hoping, at the end of February, and those will be posted to the websites. There is one tip sheet on establishing a fidelity threshold. So just to give you, to orient you to these tip sheets, these are very short, so each tip sheet is only a couple pages. But what we've done is we've just really highlighted the key things to consider as you are approaching a topic like how do we establish a fidelity threshold score. And then at the end of each tip sheet, there are resources that you can go to for much more in-depth information. And so for the threshold, for the threshold one, there are some some resources there. In the meantime, if you are in a rush, I forget who asked that question about the threshold score, please contact us. We have our emails here. We'll switch to that in a minute. Or reach out to your DAISY or ECTA TA provider or whatever TA center that you are working with, and we can help you. These are complicated methods and topics, and those of us who've been doing evaluation for many years, this is not easy stuff. So we are happy to help and point you to people or resources to help you move forward in collecting high quality data. So moving on to the next bullet, another resource and tool, well, there's a resource and tool section on the ECTA statewide implementation guide. There's a link there. And Margaret mentioned the qualitative methods. If you want to supplement some of your quantitative data, DAISY produced a brief on using qualitative methods. Okay, so there's our contact information. And again, if you have an urgent question about any of these topics, or if you just today need a resource on establishing a fidelity threshold, please email us. But again, reach out to your TA providers, and we will be happy to get you the support that you need. Okay, so I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions. There's our websites. If you have a question, put it in the chat by opening your chat window, hovering at the bottom, or hovering over the raise your hand and select that, and then you can unmute. But anything else from our presenters today? Can you go back to contact? Yes. Katie, can you go back to the emails? Colleen, I hope that's what you are asking for. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Contact any of us. We're happy to give you some information. I am not seeing any questions in the chat. Hopefully, for some of you, this was a review and telling you that you're on the right path. Again, this is it is very difficult to measure human behaviors. So we do our best to provide you with some information to help you move forward, but if you need more individualized help, please reach out. So I think officially we will conclude the webinar, but we will stay on for a few more minutes and give people a chance to ask questions. One more thing. We mentioned at the beginning that the webinar is being recorded, and we will post the recording and the slides on the ECTA and DAISY websites. Also, you will be getting an evaluation. We really appreciate you taking just the few minutes that it takes to complete those evaluations. That provides very valuable information to us. So thank you in advance for doing that. And with that, I think officially we will end, but we will stay on in case anyone has a question. So thank you, everybody, and best wishes in your efforts to evaluate practice change and fidelity.
And Debbie, this is Kellen. I'll just go ahead and stop the recording, but I'll keep paying attention for a few more minutes to see if anyone raises their hand.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.